At the time, Democrats were called Republicans and Republicans were called Federalists. But Andrew Jackson changed that, making his the Democratic Republican Party. And as the first working-class president, Jackson kicked out 20% of the people working for the government and started the presidential tradition of firing all those who had worked for the previous administration, putting his own friends in their place, and he called it turning the soil. When the administration protested, Jackson just called it office rotation and went off to play his banjo. Andrew Jackson was a gambler and had fought a duel and was shot in the chest, and the bullet had to be left next to his heart where it hurt for the rest of his life. But the other guy had been successfully put down by Jackson's return shot. The first problem Andrew Jackson faced as president was the scandal of a Navy officer who had sent a man to sea so he could stay home with the man's wife, and soon the man died of drinking or disease at sea. Jackson ordered the Navy officer to marry the woman left behind, and everyone took sides in the affair. So the first months of Jackson's presidency were embroiled in the scandal, but soon enough, Andrew Jackson was on a roll. Southern plantation owners thought that Jackson was poor white trash because he didn't want to be a rich plantation owner. And Jackson didn't trust rich people because he thought they were selfish and miserable and corrupt. And Jackson believed poor people were hard-working and honest and full of spirit. Jackson didn't want to build roads in Kentucky at taxpayer expense because it served too few people, and he stood up against the national bank that he saw as a collusion of government with big business, which would have allowed fascism. And Jackson saw the interests of the majority squashed by the few Americans doing business at the national bank. The question was, where did the U.S. government have the authority to regulate commerce, and on the other hand, was supposed to make commerce possible? The bankers wanted to create a strong economy, but Jackson saw it all as a contest between the rich and the ordinary people, and the big plantation owners were at the top of his hit list. South Carolina wanted to quit the Union over the slavery question, and Jackson called them traitors and threatened to send in U.S. troops. But the economy of the big plantations was bigger than the government itself, and Jackson owned slaves himself. When the Alamo was besieged in 1836, Jackson thought that adding Texas to the Union was a trick to get in another slave state, so the military wasn't given what it needed to support this land grab. When Andrew Jackson was re-elected in 1832, he went after the national bank, telling the senators that the government could simply take all its money out of the bank, and then where would they be? The bank retaliated with a panic followed by a depression, and after much suffering, the bank stopped calling loans in hopes Jackson would reconsider, but instead he turned it into a state bank, even though it would fail in a few years anyway. Jackson put the government's money into a handful of state banks, and that made paper money bloom with inflation, so Jackson declared that land could be paid for only in gold or silver, and that would stop the inflation. Senator Benton wrote up the papers for this new law, since they had become friends by now, but Benton wanted land prices low enough that people could afford to move west, and with the end of the inflation came a depression a year later, and Jackson was voted out, and the new President Van Buren stepped up to the plate. When Jackson put the U.S. Bank out of business, the South responded by printing its own money, and would later have to go to war to defend that paper money. And the small banks that were left after the U.S. Bank closed its doors started printing money too, and they lent it to people to buy land, so the price of a farm rose higher and higher. Farmers planted more crops and factories sprung up as all that money flowed like water, and many people got a piece of the pie on their own plate as the pie itself grew. Business was booming and everybody was happy until Andrew Jackson put a stop to all that, saying money could only be printed if there was gold or silver to back it up, and banks quickly went out of business and jobs dried up, and that would help to fire up the gold rush. 4 years later, the Americans voted Jefferson's party out of power for the first time in 40 years, and the new President Harrison held office for a month before getting sick and dying of pneumonia in 1841, and the U.S. independent Treasury was born in 1841 out of the Panic of 1837 and would be strengthened in 1846, but this time the public relied on local banks while the independent Treasury handled the government's money. With the new U.S. independent Treasury, money circulating in America and the government's money were divorced, and Van Buren had come up with this idea of a sub-treasury in 1840. Many good private banks prevailed, but out on the frontier all banks suffered from speculation and general lawlessness. And after 20 good years with the independent Treasury, the national banking system would be born in 1863 and 1864 to replace the former banking laws, not merely to handle money for the war between the states, but to stabilize and regulate the entire banking system, because counterfeiters had again been hard at work, especially Confederate counterfeiters. From then on, each bank needed a license and was required to keep $150,000 in capital assets, as well as purchase a $50,000 bond from the independent Treasury. And smaller banks were required to buy a U.S. Treasury bond in the same 1/4 amount of its capital assets. A tax of 10% was put on all bonds sold by the state and local banks to encourage bond buyers to purchase securities from the U.S. Treasury and its licensed banks instead of from the private banks, and the tax gradually forced all state notes out of existence. The U.S. independent Treasury allowed government funds to be deposited in the licensed banks, and they could use that money to buy bonds from the Treasury, and the U.S. Treasury relied on Congress to approve its creation of cash for deposit into the licensed banks. Not only the banks, but also the railroads in America were built by private companies and not by the government. And the railroad companies had to either borrow money from a bank to build their railroads or raise money in the stock market by selling stock to the public. When railroad companies had such a stranglehold on the competition that they could charge any rate they demanded, the monopolies made the cost of shipping rise faster than workers could demand raises. And competition between railroad companies should have lowered prices, but J.P. Morgan had to physically lock them into a room to get that done, and his agreement would not outlast him. J.P. Morgan was called the father of American mergers, and when stock speculation in railroad futures put so many railroads out of business, J.P. Morgan bought up failing railroad companies and joined them to his own railroad companies, and he would build or buy factories to produce the things the railroads needed. J.P. Morgan would go directly to the companies to force them to keep up the quality of their products in order to protect his investors, and J.P. Morgan's merger with U.S. Steel in 1901 made the stock market rise 500%. Teddy Roosevelt helped labor unions grow in hopes of standing up to the monopolies, especially the railroads. And the law of supply and demand dictated that if there was only one supplier, the cost of a train ticket could be demanded at any price. But if a cheaper way to travel was available, then competition would force down the price. The biggest customer was the government itself, and when America stayed out of the first 2 years of the Great War, the U.S. government contracted with the DuPont Company for a smokeless gunpowder plant to be built in Nashville, Tennessee, called the Old Hickory Plant. And the DuPonts made $60 million a year in profit during the 4 years of the war. Leather goods, clothing manufacturers, food processors, and every kind of machine maker imaginable were selling goods overseas at incredible prices, and when the war ended, many Europeans felt robbed by superinflated invoices, but that's just the rule of the law of the marketplace. The new Federal Reserve System was a uniquely American structure and would be perfected with the administrative Procedures Act, APA, in the late 60s, thanks to spectacular lawyers who allowed business to police the government from itself. And the APA was shaped by James Landis, who believed that good government required administrative agencies to carry out the laws made by Congress, and that each agency should act as a mini-government with a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch, and these were to be subject to a separate judiciary reviewable by federal courts. Landis had taken over as the chairman of the SEC when Joe Kennedy had to step down in September of 1935. And Landis had clerked for the Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, the man who had invented the American Federal Reserve System. And Brandeis had become a Supreme Court Justice in 1916 and served for 23 years. And Brandeis was Jewish and used everything good about the Torah to improve the American government. Brandeis wrote a book called Other People's Money in 1914 that said using other people's money should be a matter of trust, and that other people's money must not be used for private exploitation. And Landis wrote a book in 1938 called The Administrative Process, where he said that experts were needed in government rather than self-interested time wasters. Landis had been a federal trade commissioner in the FCC before becoming a commissioner for the SEC, and the Landis-Brandeis model for American government made it possible for government to make business possible by holding private corporations accountable to the rule of law, protecting their rights and their best interests. Corporations could sue the separate administrations in an independent court if government regulations interfered unduly in their business, and 90% of the laws in America were written for the sole purpose of keeping government from interfering in private business. When a bank under the Federal Reserve System went bust, the money was gone for good because it wasn't a national bank like the Bank of England. And to protect small accounts, the FSLIC was created because bank failures before the New Deal made people not trust the banks. And without people depositing money into banks, there was not enough held by the banks to collateralize a loan from the Fed, who would raise or lower interest rates on its loans to the member banks to either control inflation or promote money circulation. When too much money was being loaned out by member banks, the Fed would raise the rate and cost the members more to borrow from the Fed than was being collected from interest on consumer loans. And when not enough loans were being made, making money too scarce to promote business, the Fed would lower the rate to encourage banks to borrow from the Fed and earn money on interest collected from small loans. The bank's customers could choose between banks for the lower interest rate on small loans, and to keep money in the banks so they could make loans, the FSLIC guaranteed all deposits of less than $5,000 if the bank failed, and this system made it possible for more Americans to go into business. Hoover's expertise was put to work in 1949 and 1953 to update the new administrative age in America, because by 1952 many retiring military had found work in the government, and they'd been hired as official regulators until the agencies became more like membership clubs. JFK tried to make them less elitist by appointing people to modernize the APA in the 60s. And when JFK called Landis, he was told that while gold had once been the keystone to currency exchange, now market saturation was the fulcrum of the monetary system. In other words, the simple law of supply and demand. The Kennedy administration believed what Arthur Oken said: the market needs a place, and the market needs to be kept in its place. But the judicial system had not been able to handle the avalanche of complaints after the APA was created by the New Deal, and then expanded in 1946, and the government was bound by law to make APA courts available. So JFK improved the system by making state courts responsible for hearing cases of agency abuses. The state courts had the power to punish the agencies for wasting the state's time or money, and if the state courts failed to police their own agencies, private lawyers could appeal to the federal courts for relief, an expensive proposition for the states, because the U.S. government looked down on having to waste their time on business belonging to the states. American law needed healthy, well-paid private lawyers to make the system work. And these would lose business if Americans were unhappy with their services and chose to represent themselves instead. And every private lawyer eagerly looked forward to the opportunity to bring a worthy case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And because the business of the federal government was to put state agencies back on the right track, as in Brown v. Board of Education, suing state governments promised big attorney fees. The New Deal regulations prompted American companies to create ingenious production methods in order to outmaneuver government regulations, and these companies were helped because their business costs were now tax-deductible, and the oil companies especially benefited by taking the enormous cost of drilling off their taxes. As the improved administrative laws were being passed in America in 1946, some economic treatises written by William Beveridge about socialism had been found in Hitler's bombed-out bunker, and this Beveridge plan had been voted in by the war-weary people of Britain after Hitler's death, giving all English people free health care and many other government programs that turned Britain into a welfare state. The new Prime Minister, who won the election away from Churchill, was an ardent socialist, and in July of 1945, he nationalized British coal mining, railroads, manufacturing, radio, and telecommunications. But it was not such a radical change because individuals working for the government already owned controlling shares in most all industry in Britain, with the majority on their boards comprised of these major shareholders. And even if a popular candidate wanted to serve on a board, they would first have to get past the nomination committee. The board and the shareholders in Britain were the same people anyway, and so the government ruled the marketplace, paying compensation to the boards and corporate officers far in excess of any possible profits. And the British economy remained dangerously top-heavy, and Britain also nationalized the Bank of England. From Outlines of English History, page 162. America loaned Britain £1 trillion in 1945, and Britain nationalized the coal mines and the electricity industry in 1947, and nationalized the natural gas industry in 1948, and Britain devalued the pound in 1949, and the following year in 1950, Britain nationalized the iron and steel industry. Churchill had signed an agreement at FDR's house in September of 1944, extending the Quebec Agreement of 1943, saying that the U.S. would share atomic secrets with Britain. But those agreements were so secret that they were unknown to the U.S. Congress, and when the McMahon Act was passed in July of 1946, setting up the Atomic Energy Commission, atomic secrets were denied to Britain. The previous month, Donald Trump had been born 100 years after the Bear Flaggers had knocked on the door of the Mexican governor's hacienda on the 14th of June in 1846, and within 10 years of the 1st of March in 1955, Sir Winston Churchill announced that Britain would build a hydrogen bomb. On the 5th of April, Sir Winston Churchill resigned. On the 1st of March in 1955, Sir Winston Churchill announced that Britain would build a hydrogen bomb. On the 5th of April, Sir Winston Churchill resigned, and on the 15th of May in 1957, Britain detonated its first hydrogen bomb, and 3 years later, England launched their first nuclear submarine in October of 1960, and in 1967 the pound was devalued 14.3%. Parliament could not separate the Treasury from the Royal Navy without their permission, which meant not at all, and the Royal Navy threatened to set off their atomic bomb if Parliament refused to give them as much money as they claimed to need, and because the Royal Navy cost so much to maintain, the social programs suggested by the new Prime Minister to make the workers stop striking could not be funded without finding revenue from sources other than the taxpayer. Since the private sector in England was now too poor to pay their fair share of taxes, even if they could have been made more willing, Britain became embroiled in international skullduggery that has yet to see the light of day. Had the office of the Prime Minister been separated from the Treasury, England would have worked as well as America worked, with Congress being required to open the Treasury accounts to the President, rather than the President being allowed to ask the Treasurer himself, or worse, in the case of Churchill after May 10, 1940. The Treasurer being the Chairman of the Navy, as in the CEO and the Chairman of the Board being the same person. The English upper class refuses to face the unpleasant facts of life, that the world has changed, that England is no longer what it used to be, that Britain cannot go on living beyond her means and expecting others to pay for it. A new way of thinking, new education will be needed to cure the sickness of the pound where it should be cured, at its very source. And the merchant bankers will have to be the educators and doctors. The Merchant Bankers by Joseph Wexburg, New York, Simon & Schuster, 1966, page 12 and 13. In the 20s, Britain had nationalized electricity and nationalized overseas air travel in 1939, but in 1945 they went whole hog, and while control of British industry had been underinvested and under-aggressive, the nationalized businesses became public corporations after Hitler's war that were state-owned, and 20% of British workers were thus employed by the government, although there was not much capital invested in these state-owned industries since much of their overseas investments had been destroyed in the war. Most unfortunately for Britain, the Royal Navy could not invest the stolen Odilo treasure without disclosing its existence, and they would lose control of all that gold towards reparation payments due the United States. Monday, July 10, 1944. Ike told me later that the PM gave him hell for insisting on the Anvil operation, the British Premier still being wedded to the pursuit of the Germans in Italy and to possibilities in the Balkans. My 3 years with Eisenhower, the personal diary of Captain Harry C. Butcher, page 608. In the early 30s, British banks were more willing to lend money to Americans than the American banks themselves, and the U.S. government had gone into debt to British banks because they had been running short of tax money as the result of Prohibition. The loans made to Europe during the Great War had been made in ammunition, food, and other supplies, not in cash, so to pay back the U.S. Treasury for having purchased these items along with the cost of sending them over, the U.S. Treasury was asking for gold as payment because payment in kind would put American industries out of work since America already had all the ammunition, food, and supplies it needed. If Britain sent the same stuff back, it would do America no good, so the U.S. Treasury had demanded gold. And in the 30s, the British began sailing down the Vistula into Silesia to drum up some funny business in Poland, trying to raise the price of English coal, and Stalin and Hitler signed the Non-Aggression Pact, dividing Poland between them on the 23rd of August in 1939 in order to keep the British away from the Silesian coal mines. One theory was that if Germany were to attack Poland and the Poles lost, then Germany could face Russia and thereby do away with Britain's major threat to their plantations in India, and the Germans would put down the only country in the world with an absolute need to control the Dardanelles at the Strait of Constantinople. So the British had begun making pacts with France and Poland as soon as the guns of the Great War had gone quiet. France nationalized most everything French after Hitler's war, which was easy because they simply seized anything compromised by conspiracy with the Nazis. And most French workers had proclaimed themselves communists just to oppose the Nazis. If the workers in France weren't given a decent living wage and a safest possible workplace, they threatened to ask Russia to march on over to help them out, and the polarization of the two ideologies caused France to spin its wheel for decades, with the conflict centered on the unions versus the government, and there were too few private interests to break the tie. The father of the European Union came from a rich family in Cognac who sold brandy, and he had traveled the world selling cognac after quitting school at the age of 16. And he had met many important people in his travels, and he came back to Paris with enough clout to quit his job and move into Cézanne's dealer's house that he used as his office. The father of the European Union fell in love with a married Italian woman, and he flew her to Russia in 1934 to make her a Soviet citizen so she could obtain a divorce because she'd been turned down in Reno, Nevada. So the father of the European Union married her, and away they went to China to help build railroad tracks incompatible with Russian trains, and the incompatible railway gauge was being installed in cahoots with British investors. British money had also gone into the building of railroads in America, as well as the rest of the world, so when Britain backed the Confederacy, they lost most of their money invested in Southern railroads, and the Chinese adventure would make them sorry again in 1949, when Mao nationalized all the railroads in China. In Germany, a group of economists at the University of Freiburg were warning that only competition could prevent totalitarianism, and they said that monopolies were ripe pickings for total control by government, so government should be in the business of making competition possible. That was fine and good, but they also wanted a state bank to prevent inflation, and when the Allied occupiers began replacing the German Reichsmark with the Deutschmark in June of 1948, Russia responded on the 23rd of June with a blockade of Berlin, and NATO was created in April of 1949. West Germany was born the following month on the 8th of May in 1949, 4 years after the surrender ending Hitler's war, and the new chancellorship was won by Adenauer, whose wife had just died from being held in a Gestapo prison. Adenauer's economics minister was one of the Freiburg economists, and by 1969 the German government would own a quarter of the shares in most German companies, and state-owned corporations included transportation, energy, telephone, television, and radio. In England and France, the goal had been to provide bottom-up welfare, while in Germany, the goal was to make the business of business possible, and the key in Germany had been their inclusion of unionized labor with supervisory boards that included representatives from all three sectors of government, business, and labor. Within a decade, Germany had outshadowed the rest of Europe, while Britain was embracing the economist Keynes, who had been an advisor to the Treaty of Versailles after the Great War, and he had warned that the Versailles Treaty would be bad for Germany. Keynes had also been against the crown returning to the gold standard in the 1920s, and he liked the idea of government borrowing money to create jobs and then collect taxes. And he'd worked to create the Bretton Woods Agreement that started the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Keynes dreamed of Britain getting out from under America's thumb, since he had grown up during the good old days when the sun never set on the British Empire, and the Achilles heel in Keynesianism was that ideas could displace commodities, meaning that disrupting markets or cheating on debts was fair game in the financial scheme of things, without actually having to bring anything worthwhile to the market. The Keynes approach worked well for business, but Keynesian governments hijacked the idea to borrow money for creating bureaucratic jobs that didn't accomplish anything more than making trouble for others, then asking for more borrowed funds to clean up the mess they had made in an endless Sisyphean cycle. In his sunset years, Keynes obtained a multi-billion-dollar loan for Britain from the U.S., and during Hitler's war, Armand had made direct donations to England with his support of the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, and Armand had been put in charge of the Wines and Spirits Division. The day after a U.S. B-25 crashed into the Empire State Building on the 28th of July in 1945, wiping out the entire 78th floor where there had been a Catholic charity, Armand called and rented the 78th floor and rebuilt it in 11 months. Armand used wood paneling from England left over from the days of King James of the Bible that he had bought from an English dealer at a bargain price, and the paneling had come from the room where the treaty was signed ending the English Civil War in 1645. The British protested that one of their national treasures was leaving the country, and Parliament engaged in hot debate, and Armand felt sorry for them. So when Elizabeth II assumed the throne in 1953, he gifted the paneling back to her, and Winston Churchill received the paneling and installed it in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Armand paid for the shipping and the entire installation. When Ike became president that year, he appointed Herbert Hoover to look into the Iran matter and the role that Britain was playing, because Iran had been living off oil royalties paid by Anglo-Iranian, but the oil company was paying 4 times as much money in taxes to the crown than they were realizing in oil sales, and Iran was asking for more money for their oil and less money going towards crown taxes. The first transatlantic flight in 1920 had opened a new market for Iranian oil, while the railroads burning petroleum were continuing to expand, and Germany was adding to its 40,000 miles of rail lines compared to the over 250,000 miles of track there had been in America in 1916. As soon as the Great War ended, people were allowed to use all the gas they could find, which had helped to spread the flu in 1918 and 1919. And ships burning oil had carried soldiers home from all over the world, and the returning soldiers had brought the flu with them, which hit so hard that there were not enough people to take care of the sick, with victims just laid in hallways of hospitals or in makeshift tents. When the flu finally abated after the Great War, people got back to their farms and produced so much that there were surpluses of milk and meat and produce well into the 30s. And the ability to ship farm products over the railroads did not help cut down on the surpluses, because oil was much cheaper than coal to power the trains. Farmers just couldn't sell as much as they made, and as part of the New Deal, the government got involved in agriculture. After the war between the states, the North had come down and cut down most of the trees in the South and sold them. There had been some floods in the past, but now the really bad floods began. The rain raced down, eroded hills, and devastated everybody downriver. They had no choice but to dam the river. Valley of Vision, the TVA Years, by Martha E. Munzer, by the Conservation Foundation, New York, Alfred A. Knopf, 1969, page 13 and 14. The Tennessee River went through 7 states, an area larger than Great Britain, and the TVA did much more than supply electricity, but brought in agricultural experts to tell farmers how to save land damaged by flood erosion. The TVA helped fertilizer factories get going, and they planted trees, and people from governments all over the world came to see the miracle of the TVA. Electricity had put an end to the old ways of life, and things were going well until the demand grew bigger than the supply of electricity. and the Tennessee River Basin was just not big enough to make all the electricity people wanted, so they started strip mining coal, and the TVA got into the coal-fired steam business. In the 30s, coal from Silesia made Poland Germany's eastern trading partner, and when Britain signed a pact with Poland that was a trade deal about coal, Poland shifted from trading with Germany to doing deals with Britain. The British had also been trying to drum up business in France, and Hitler's moving into that market had not been favorable to Britain. And Italy went to help the Albanians keep the British out of the Balkans, and Stalin made a pact with Germany just to get back at the British boycott of Russia. Across the ocean, the American economy would boom during Hitler's war, not only because private companies were managing industries rather than the government directing the work, which is what was going on overseas, but because women had been allowed to work during the war. By 1932, there had been almost $16 billion in U.S. banks on deposit in the form of coins, notes, and certificates, and American money became fiat in 1933 when it was no longer exchanged directly for gold but had been allowed to float on its own worth. And instead of gold making the dollar valuable, its popularity and basic trust in America would now determine its value. Stock speculation raged during Hitler's war, and newspapers and radio broadcasts would come up with fake news from the battlefield, hoping to set off panic buying and selling in order to enrich the rumor mongers. Propaganda warfare spread to the movie industry, and Paul Joseph Goebbels used thousands of soldiers and untold other resources desperately needed elsewhere in his pursuit of creating propaganda news. And as the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Goebbels managed to bleed away gigantic amounts of equipment and manpower towards his movie projects, especially in the form of alcohol. Goebbels had a crush on Leni Riefenstahl and tried to attract her to join in his media efforts, but Leni was in love with her work and spurned Goebbels' attentions. The prime contribution made by the Minister of Propaganda had been to get affordable radios into German homes, where the message of Nazi success could reach every hard-working German, and all Hitler's speeches were broadcast directly into people's living rooms, while FDR was doing the same thing in America. There had been 5,000 radios in German homes in 1920. And there would be 2.5 million 4 years later, and the radio would tell them that the English were crooks and that the French were sneaks, and a German cleaning lady at the White House told FDR how much she loved hearing Hitler over her radio. Heinrich Hertz had discovered radio waves in 1887, and on the 2nd of November in 1920, the American presidential election of Harding was broadcast by radio. And by 1921 there were 8 broadcast stations and 600 the following year, and by 1922 radio broadcasting had begun in Britain. When Hitler spoke on the radio for the first time, it had been very effective, and George Bailey said that the German language sounded like it got things done. Inventors came up with feedback amplifiers in 1928, and by 1934 the Nazis mounted them on trucks to drive around broadcasting their message over loudspeakers, and by 1935 the radio airwaves were full. The BBC had begun broadcasting television from Alexandria Palace in 1929, and by 1936 the BBC was broadcasting television regularly, and in America the CBS radio station was all ready to have Hitler speak on the 11th of December in 1931, but it was cancelled by the German government at the last minute. While Hitler had been encouraged to learn to speak English, he claimed to have been too busy, and so many Americans spoke German that Hitler's speech would have gotten across in America anyway. And the following year, in 1932, The Nazis mailed out 50,000 phonograph records of Hitler speaking, and they used the new loudspeakers to play the recorded speeches, and they were showing newsreels and movies of his speeches on street corners, projected onto the sides of buildings. The Nazis were spreading nasty rumors about opposing candidates, and so were the Jew communist newspapers. And when an opposition newspaper found out that the leader of the SA was gay, the Nazi Party almost lost the election. One Vienna newspaper reported on Hitler's Jewish ancestry, but Germans didn't believe it. And when Hitler made a speech on the 28th of April in 1939, it was broadcast all over the world, and the 3 major networks in America covered it. Radio technology had also advanced into the invention of the field radio used for the first time during Hitler's war, and that would be an important addition to success on the battlefield. At the beginning of the Great War, the Germans had telegraph while the Russians had been delivering field orders on foot, a phenomenon described in stunning detail in Solzhenitsyn's book, August 1914, that would be published in 1971. Technology gave a distinct advantage to one side over the other, and the first useful tool in warfare had been the wheel, although some believed the hammer came first. The first telegraph had been discovered by a group of monks in France, who stood in a huge circle holding some wire while someone threw a switch on a generator, and the monks reported that every one of them felt the shock at the same time. The Italian Marconi and the German Karl Braun had invented the wireless telegraph, and Marconi had been reading the work of the German Mr. Hertz, and he also used Maxwell's research to create the wireless, and Marconi had believed he was receiving messages from other planets. Samuel Morse had been born in America and went to England in 1810 to be an artist. And he learned to paint historical scenes and then came back to America, but people only wanted their portraits painted, so Morse had gone hungry. Samuel Morse invented a flexible piston pump for fire engines in 1817, and then he ran for mayor of New York but only got a few votes. And Morse built an electrical toy in 1832 that he told Congress could send secret messages. Congress gave him some money to string wire in 1843 for the famous telegraph message, "What hath God wrought?" that was successfully sent from the U.S. Capitol in May of 1944. And the telegraph was initially used by the railroads because electricity could be shot through the rails instead of having to string wire. The transatlantic cable linked England with America in 1858, and within 2 months fish ate the insulation. So a new transatlantic cable was laid by the Great Eastern in 1866, and by 1910 the new wireless telegraph allowed San Francisco to receive a message from a ship 4,000 miles away. The wireless had been around for only 15 years when it was put on board the Titanic, and the captain didn't know if his Marconi SOS had been received, because the wireless was a new tool, thought to be more of a toy for rich folks to amuse themselves. The Titanic left from Waterloo Station, and 3 brothers who had signed on as crew members missed the boat because they'd been drinking in the Grapes Tavern. And when newspapers first reported the Titanic disaster, it was difficult to believe, although many thought calling it unsinkable had been flying in the face of God. Some thought that perhaps God had given a warning that relying on technology and science was asking for trouble, an idea that would be resurrected when the telegraph made the 1929 stock market crash possible, as trades were made at lightning speed. Samuel Morse had charged a quarter to let brokers see a demonstration of his telegraph, and in no time telegraph offices had sprung up all over Wall Street, and smaller stock exchanges were no longer needed in other cities because stocks could now be traded over the telegraph from New York City. Thomas Edison invented a ticker tape machine for Wall Street that improved the one they'd been using to print on paper tape since 1867. And the ticker tape had allowed people to stand outside the market to see the results of their trading rather than having to make their way onto the floor. The Wall Street Journal was published by Mr. Jones and Mr. Dow in July of 1889, and they printed their new Dow Jones average in their newspaper that they were selling for 2 cents. And there had been a third partner in Dow and Jones named Charles Milford Bergstresser, but his name was too long, so they left it out. The Wall Street Journal had been started by Bergstresser in 1882 because he wanted to show the world the difference between facts and opinions, and during Hitler's war, the price of a newspaper would rise to 3 cents, but anyone purchasing the Wall Street Journal said it was worth every penny. Thomas Edison's first invention had been a machine that could record votes in Congress, but it was rejected because Congress liked that voting took a long time, and they were more interested in the process than in the results. Edison was born 3 years after the end of the war between the states, and he made movie machines and record players and light bulbs, and Edison tried inventing something that would allow people to talk to the dead, and he also believed that Martians were listening to his radio. Edison spent a lot of time fighting with Tesla, so neither of them got the Nobel Prize. And Edison wanted direct current, while Tesla used alternating current, and Tesla invented the rotating magnetic motor that eliminated the need to constantly replace contact brushes. Tesla invented the radio, but Marconi was working for Edison at the time and got the credit for the wireless. And after Edison died in 1931, the Edison Electric Light Company became the General Electric Company, or GE, that brought good things to life. The telephone linked New York to San Francisco in January of 1915. And Eastman's box camera, invented in 1888, evolved into moving cameras, and the first movies showed ignorant people being taken advantage of by people in the sophisticated cities, a theme that amused the city people and served as a fair warning to the country folks. Some people worried that these movies were teaching criminals how to commit crimes. So the U.S. Board of Censorship was born, and Edison did his part to censor films by hiring thugs to beat up people making movies he didn't like. Edison especially liked Birth of a Nation, while filmmakers who didn't agree with Edison decided to get out of town, which was why movie makers went to California. Movies helped to spread the notion that the communist proletariat was a romantic ideal of the common struggling man, and after the Great War, these Jew communist movies were sweeping over Germany. Films such as The Outcasts by Gerhard Lamprecht in 1925 that glorified the poor, with a story about a man living in a homeless shelter after he'd been released from prison, having been put in prison for a worthy cause, and when set free he was given a small job that made him very happy, and he was quickly promoted when his worth was immediately recognized by his boss. Hitler would have seen this film, and the heralding of the common man was shared by both Nazis and communists, and much of the thrill of communism was from a backlash over the Great War, when people decided that the common man was not inferior to the nobility as they had been led to believe, but was able to endure outrageous suffering and capable of incredible courage. Nobility was out, and commoners were in, and Hitler became the first common man elected to public office in Germany, thanks to the moving picture industry. A book called The Wizard of Oz was made into a movie in 1925 and became the first uniquely American fairy tale, and would be remade in 1939 starring Judy Garland and the Singer Midgets. And the book's author, L. Frank Baum, wanted to tell stories that were less frightening than the Grimm's fairy tales he'd heard as a child. When Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, nobody wanted to publish it, and Baum had to pay for its publishing himself. When he was young, Baum had been given a printing press in 1900, and he printed a monthly newsletter called the Rose Lawn Home Journal. And Baum became a reporter for the New York World and also started his own newspaper called The New Era. Baum had done theater, acting and directing Shakespeare, and he wrote a musical comedy that played on Broadway. Then Baum took it on tour for several years until he married and had 4 children and began writing children's books. One of them was called The Magical Monarch of Moe, and the hero was a girl who was not afraid to speak freely, and her friends were also able to speak for themselves, while the bad guys were easily defeated by simple honesty. In Baum's stories, when science went wrong, everything worked out all right in the end, and his wizard was not all powerful, but needed help from a trinity and an innocent young girl who freed him from having to keep secrets, especially from himself, according to Donald A. Wollheim, in an introduction to Baum's most famous book about Oz. In this dream world of Oz, integrity must always triumph. Those who are mean cannot win for long. Honesty and free speech cannot be thwarted. Each person can find happiness in his own way and have it to keep. Such is surely the American dream, and it is this, in my opinion, that makes L. Frank Baum's Oz eternal. The Land of Oz, 1904, by L. Frank Baum, New York, Airmont Publishing Company, Inc., 1969, page 7 in Introduction. Wollheim said that The Wizard of Oz was popular because it made magic scientific, rather than something that was done in the woods by witches. And Baum wrote 12 sequels to The Wizard of Oz, with one more published after his death that people said was the best yet. The Oz stories are fairy tales, but they are also of the same basic stuff of which science fiction is made. Oz is somewhere on Earth. It can be reached, but it is hidden for causes that are made clear and are possibly explicable. Sorcery can be learned. It requires tools. It follows established methods. Not everything can be done by magic. Only some things are possible, and they must be found by experiment and thoughtful ingenuity. Ibid. The worship of science was an old idea that the Catholic Church had been fighting for centuries, and religious people shunned science because it still looked a lot like magic, and most of the claims about medical breakthroughs made by snake oil salesmen didn't work. While the Christian God was thought to be more effective than the scientific method. Magic gave people hope and allowed sick people time to heal instead of being bled, cupped, leeched, or exorcised, and because magic potions and rituals left people alone long enough to get better, it worked more often than doctors, but it didn't work often enough, and sickness was everywhere, and death a constant companion. Life expectancy in the year 1300 was 25 years, so teenagers were deciding most government actions during the Dark Ages. And by 1789, an expected lifespan had grown to 34 years, and in 1850 it was 39 years, and that improved to 50 years by the turn of the century in 1900. One could be expected to live to age 55 in 1920 and then 69 years in 1960. And by 1996, over 15,000 people in America would be over 100 years old. It had been thought during the Dark Ages that suffering was noble, so they would seek out pain such as kneeling for hours in prayer or whipping themselves or going without food or wearing scratchy clothes, or becoming hermits and taking vows of silence. In 1550, nobody knew how blood circulated, And Aristotle had proposed that only heavenly bodies went in circles, while things on earth had a beginning and an end. So doctors believed that blood just pumped back and forth, and it was not until Leonardo da Vinci that medical school became more than just cutting up dead bodies while a professor droned on in Latin. By 1570, French doctors decided that gunshot wounds healed better if treated with a poultice rather than with boiling oil, and they found that amputations worked better if the blood vessels were tied rather than sealed with a red-hot iron. And they also figured out how to turn breech babies before they were born. Anesthetic would not be invented until 1846, but being able to put patients to sleep only made surgery more dangerous because they still had no idea what caused infection, which Lister would remedy in 1865. Every few years, whole communities would go stark raving mad because they stored their grain in common rather than in small piles in separate homes, and the piles were too large to let in air to keep out moisture, so the grain would grow a specific mold that had hallucinogenic properties, namely ergot, and whole villages would lose their minds after eating it. Sometimes the symptoms would only subside when they ran out of grain, and ergot didn't cause mere hallucinations, but also made the hands and feet turn black, and feeding the moldy grain to chickens made their feet turn black too. Life could get quite grim in the old days, where people had strange ideas about the spiritual world causing disease, and they would spend long winters with no other illumination than a small fire that made the presence of ghosts very real. And when the epidemic passed, they would burn a few women as witches thought to be the source of the problem. Before 1780, half of all babies died before their 10th birthday. And by 1820, only 1/3 of them died, and in Hungary the statistics were much better after Semmelweis told doctors to wash their hands before delivering babies. Before Semmelweis, doctors spent their time between births in the cadaver rooms cutting up corpses, so giving birth in hospitals had been very dangerous, with more mothers dying in them than those who stayed at home. Bearing children anywhere was often fatal, as rickets caused pelvic bones to grow crooked, not to mention the generally poor nutrition, and babies died regularly and often, usually 1 out of 5 per family, and if twins were born, one would be murdered since it was believed that only one had a soul, so only the first-born twin was allowed to live. After the 100 Years' War, the plague would descend every 24 years to kill half the population in the next 5 years. And the first year would be the worst, with fewer dying every year until the plague crept away, leaving as mysteriously as it had come. The Black Death was spread by fleas from rats living on ships, and the large wooden ships carried hordes of rats in their inner chambers and carried them all over the world. The plague had first come from Asia over the Silk Road, and the Asian rat, that would be called the European black rat, was friendlier than the Norway wharf rat, a more fierce rodent that preferred living outside. And the European rats were not afraid of people and would move into their houses and thereby spread the plague. As the Black Death went around the world, it killed millions of people everywhere, and Germany suffered the least, while Italy suffered the most, and the good that came out of the death was that as many rich people died as poor people, which helped to put to rest the notion that nobility were superior to common folk, since plague was an equal opportunity destroyer. There was no known cure for the Black Plague, and the disease did not care whether or not people prayed, and that helped change the idea that God caused sickness as punishment because good people died right alongside the bad ones. 1 out of every 4 Europeans would die of the bubonic plague, as well as half of London, and the clothes of the dead victims were supposed to be burnt, but clothing was valuable, so people took it home after pretending to burn it. Infected houses were quarantined and exposed to the air for 40 days, even though it failed to stop the plague. And smoking tobacco was thought to prevent the disease because lungs coated with tar from tobacco or from wood soot were better able to stop airborne pathogens from entering the bloodstream. When Count von Rumford, also known as Sir Benjamin Thompson, invented an improved chimney in the 1790s, he took his idea to Russia, where people lived in small houses with an open fire indoors and a hole in the middle of the ceiling to let the smoke out. And the Russians refused to put Rumford's chimneys in their houses because they were convinced that wood smoke protected them from disease. The English needed chimneys because they were burning coal in their home fireplaces after cutting down most of their trees, since it had taken 1,000 trees to build a single ship. And coal would not replace wood in America as a source of home heating until 1885. The search for a cure for the Black Plague went on, and one doctor tried hemlock on a plague victim and reported that the old man's eyes crossed and his cheeks fell in, his skin turned gray and his breathing stopped, and no one knew that even Plato had lied and had not told about Socrates vomiting and soiling himself and dying in agony. The Year of the Death, by Reuben R. Merlis, New York, Bantam Books, Doubleday and Company, 1965-1967, page 275. Sometimes an epidemic would go on for more than 10 years, and the Great London Plague of 1665 had begun and ended with a fire, while the cause of the disease had remained a mystery. When plague was finally brought under control, it was a great boon to humanity as people were finally able to travel and engage in trade, although the scourge had not disappeared entirely, and 50,000 people in Manchuria would die of plague in 1910. The Age of Reason was the result of the Black Death because people wanted to know how it could have happened, not just the science of the disease, but what God could have possibly been thinking. Doctors thought health was a fourfold balance between hormones and bile and fluids and spirits, and that understanding gave doctors plenty of techniques with which to ply their trade, while the practice of medicine was still mostly hit or miss and included things like butcher's broom and devil's claw, while opium remained the patient's best angel in relieving all their suffering. When Elias Howe invented the sewing machine in 1846, better clothing went a long way towards staving off disease. Cholera came from India and was spread by the ships of the British East India Company, and the word quarantine came from the Italian word for 40 because sailors were kept on board for 40 days when they arrived in port to give any disease time to run its course. Spanish sailors came back from Haiti in 1493 with syphilis, and it would not be until 1909 that the German Jew Paul Ehrlich found a cure for syphilis with his compound 606. Syphilis spread as armies marched, so Napoleon can be credited with the spread of syphilis in Europe. And in the 1890s, surgeons would drill a hole in the head to relieve syphilitics, and doctors who warned against debauching as a source of unpleasant death were ridiculed as moralizers. Syphilis caused liver disease as well as heart disease, and it affected the nerves and would cause insanity and paralysis, and often blindness, anywhere from 3 to 25 years later. Syphilis also caused birth defects, so testing became a requirement for marriage in 1910 with the August von Wassermann scan, and syphilis infected from 5 to 20% of the population, but only some of them would progress into neurosyphilis to become demented and eventually die paralyzed after having convulsions. The neurosyphilitics would often think they were the Duke of France or the King of Bavaria or the Queen of Sheba, and they would frequently bankrupt their families as the disease began to destroy their brains in middle age. The affected were often under 50 years old and sometimes as young as 40, and most would not even remember at what time they had become infected. State asylums built for the poor housed a large percentage of syphilitics, and while there was no difference in the progression of the disease between men and women, 2/3 of those suffering from syphilis were men, while the females had usually become infected by their husbands. Most of the men had been infected by a single carrier, and the men with syphilis were more often from the upper class than the working class, and while most of the men were taken home from these institutions to die, the syphilitic women usually remained in the care of the state until the end. During the American War of Independence, yellow fever was brought to America by slaves revolting in the Caribbean against the French, and John Adams said that the yellow fever epidemic saved America because everyone was too busy being sick to cause any trouble for the new government. For the next century, yellow fever would kill more American soldiers than bullets, and in Cuba, creepy medical studies were done by Major Walter Reed, using people as guinea pigs, and 1/3 of the other deaths from disease in America were because of smallpox that also caused blindness. And for every person dead of the Black Plague, 100 had died of smallpox. And in some places it was rare to see people without smallpox scars. When indoor plumbing became available, less people would die of black widow spider bites. And as their contribution to medicine, the French kings promoted the manufacture of perfume that was supposed to ward off disease. In 1720, it was noticed that girls who milked cows didn't get smallpox, and cowpox vaccinations became standard among the common farmers, and Edward Jenner tried the vaccinations on prisoners in 1796, and then tried it on the royal family to reassure people of its safety, and by 1805, vaccinations were available to everyone. A Dutchman invented the first decent microscope in the 1670s and saw little beasties cavorting in a glass of water, and this was a great move towards disease becoming subject to science rather than being caused by demon possession. And while the Frenchman Louis Pasteur would work with a microscope, he spent most of his time trying to make better wine and beer. The German Dr. Koch found the bacteria that was responsible for tuberculosis in 1882 after working as a surgeon in the Franco-Prussian War. And TB usually went after the lungs but was spread to the brain and bones and some organs, and the disease caused a lot of pain, and patients became weak and coughed and sweat all night and couldn't breathe, and the body wasted away. William Roentgen discovered X-rays that could examine the lungs in 1895, and he called them X-rays because X meant unknown. And the French claimed to have created a vaccine for TB in 1921, and streptomycin became the first cure for TB in 1944. But before that, people were just sent to sanitariums, as described in Mann's book Magic Mountain that was published in 1924. That year, Dr. Florence Siebert figured out how to distill water for safe intravenous transfusions, and she isolated the active part of tuberculosis and came up with the first real test for TB, and her skin test was adopted in America in 1941 and by the WHO in 1952. Dr. Florence had contracted polio as a child and had to wear leg braces and walked with a limp all her life, so as a teenager she had read a lot of books about science and medicine. By 1900, people knew that lice spread disease thanks to Dr. Heinrich Hermann Robert Koch's research, work done after he had served as a surgeon in Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War at the age of 27. Lice specifically spread typhus, so delousing centers were set up for traveling strangers where the authorities could screen them for disease and give them a shower and launder their clothing, preventing the travelers from inflicting epidemics upon the unwary populace. Until the 19th century, Doctors hadn't been able to tell the difference between typhus, typhoid fever, and recurrent or relapsing fever, and while typhus and relapsing fever were carried by lice, the main difference was that typhus killed 50% of its victims and typhoid killed only 10%, while relapsing fever killed 70%, and the disease carried by lice died in warmer weather, so it was carried more often by lice in northern countries. During Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, more French soldiers died of typhus than had been killed by Russians. And the typhus epidemic in Russia in 1922 infected 25 million people, while Poland had 4 million cases that were largely contained due to public health efforts, while that many people died in Russia. Everyone was plagued with bedbugs, fleas, and lice, and criminals would come to the courthouse fresh from an infested jail, and all the cops and judges and lawyers would get sick, and the military would conscript volunteers from the jails, which would spread the disease to the rest of the army. The cotton industry helped stave off typhus because lice were killed by boiling clothes, and wool was destroyed when it was boiled, so cotton fabric became a welcome replacement. With more cotton mills, fabric became cheaper so people could change their clothes more often, and that helped because lice needed a period of constant warmth to grow, so the cotton plantations in the American South were allowed to ship immediately to cotton mill factories in England, while other countries that were unable to control their lice had to store their cotton for a requisite time to fulfill quarantine, and it often just rotted away.